Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 13, The Utility of Belief. I'm Brandon Seale. Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca, Alonso Castillo, Andrés Dorantes, and Estevan had planned to escape from the Native American bands holding them during the prickly pear harvest of 1533. During the prickly pear harvest, tribes from all over South Texas came together because it was pretty much the only time when the barren landscape offered enough edible foodstuffs to support mass migrations. Just days before the four old expeditionaries were about to escape, however, a fight broke out amongst their respective bands, which ended up scattering the bickering factions, and with them, the four surviving Narvaez expeditionaries. Individually, they knew they had no chance of reaching their destination on the Panuco River, the northernmost point of New Spain, wherever that was. And so their forced separation condemned them to yet another year of slavery, of mistreatment and mosquitoes, of hunger and hardship, of disease and the prospect of death every day. In his account, Cabeza de Vaca always glosses over the most desperate parts of his ordeal. And so to give you an idea of how bad of a year this really was for him, he covers it in only 3 sentences. Quote, "And this year I endured a very bad life, not only from hunger, but also from the mistreatment that I received from my Indians, such that I had to flee 3 times from the master who held me. Each time they all went out to search for me and put a lot of effort into trying to kill me. But Lord our God in his mercy wanted to preserve and protect me from them." End quote. Each word of this frustratingly short synopsis contains clues, I think, into what this year was actually like for Cabeza de Vaca. Here's the first clause again. Quote, "And this year I endured a very bad life, not only from hunger, but also from the mistreatment that I received from my Indians." Well, the archaeological record confirms the state of near constant starvation that these proto-Coahuiltecan tribes in South Texas lived in. They spent most of their time foraging the brush country, a high-energy, low-yield activity if ever there was one. For context, this is land that supports 1 cow per every 100 acres, and it takes 4 stomachs for that cow to be able to digest what it can find to eat. Naturally, this scarcity made the natives demanding masters. It wasn't just that they were sadistic, it's that the region didn't have calories to spare. And so if a man wasn't pulling his weight by bringing in resources for the tribe, what good was he? That said, Cabeza de Vaca did find the treatment he received from these Indians to be particularly cruel. And recall that Cabeza de Vaca is a man who was always able to find the silver lining in even the most gratuitous assault. See back to episode 9 if you want to know what I'm talking about. And so, given the way that he glosses over the gory details, the best evidence we have for how bad Cabeza de Vaca's mistreatment during this year really was is how he responded to it. Here's the first sentence again, now in its entirety. Quote, "And this year I endured a very bad life, not only from hunger, but also from the mistreatment that I received from my Indians, such that I had to flee 3 times from the master who held me." End quote. In his words, I had to flee. The Spanish is me hube de huir. The language suggests compulsion, almost as if God or some other external force was making him, that he had to try to escape, or else he would die, even though he knew that his keepers would kill him if they caught him trying to escape. And he was caught, 3 times actually. Quote, "They all went out to search for me and put a lot of effort into killing me," the second sentence tells us. But then the third sentence answers for us the logical question of what it was that actually sustained him. Quote, "But God our Lord, in his infinite goodness, protected me and saved my life." End quote. It's almost like after he's forced to relive this harrowing year at this point in his narrative, Cabeza de Vaca has to invoke God to calm himself, to remind himself that he got through it, even 5 years after the fact when he finally is sitting down to write this down. But what I would suggest is that in those 3 sentences, Cabeza de Vaca is not only telling us what happened during the winter of 1533-34, namely that it was bad, but he's also showing us the tools and the survival strategies that he used to endure it. There's another man whose survival strategies keep coming to mind when I read Cabeza de Vaca. In 1965, Commander Jim Stockdale was a 41-year-old wing commander flying combat sorties over North Vietnam. On September 9th, 1965, his Douglas A-4 was shot down. He ejected and deployed his parachute, and as he floated to the ground, to the waiting arms of the enemy below, he thought to himself, quote, 5 years down there, at least. I'm entering the world of Epictetus, end quote. What he meant by that reference to Epictetus was that he was about to enter the crucible of a philosophy that he had only engaged with intellectually. And I'm talking, of course, about Stoicism. Just a few years before, Stockdale had spent 2 years studying philosophy at Stanford University. There, he found himself drawn to the teachings of Epictetus and Stoicism generally as a practical philosophy for living. As Epictetus himself said, his was not a philosophy of syllogisms or of pure logic. Quote, here you practice how to die, how to be enchained, how to be racked, how to be exiled, end quote. The end goal was to learn an almost permanent posture of profound dispassion over the things in life that we cannot control. Because most of the time, how we respond is the only thing in this world that we can control. That's more easily said than done, however. And when the North Vietnamese army gets a hold of you, it suddenly becomes very real. During his captivity, Stockdale would be tortured 15 times, put in leg irons for 2 years, and placed in solitary confinement for more than 4 years. After returning to the U.S. 8 years later, incidentally, about the same amount of time that Cabeza de Vaca would be cast away in North America, Stockdale wrote about his experience and tried to extract from it his own philosophy for enduring hardship. The first step, he says, is admitting, up front and very early on, your fragility, your vulnerability, your nakedness, if you want to use Cabeza de Vaca's language. In Stockdale's words, you must, quote, confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be, end quote. You have to accept that you'll be forced to say and do things that you swore you never would. You have to accept that at some point, your captors will break you. Your will and your physical strength aren't enough. Remember Lope de Oviedo back on Galveston Island? Or the concentration camp inmate that Viktor Frankl told us about, who died when his liberation failed to materialize on the exact day that he dreamed it would. Stockdale offers us a similar example, describing those who came into the Hanoi Hilton full of willpower and positive thinking. Quote, they were the ones who said, we're going to be out of here by Christmas. And Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we're going to be out by Easter. And Easter would come and Easter would go. And then Thanksgiving. And then it would be Christmas again. And they died of a broken heart, end quote. Hope by itself is not a strategy for survival. All that said, according to Stockdale, even as you're refusing to delude yourself, you must simultaneously believe something else. Something, in fact, that seems to be in direct contradiction to what we just said. Despite never losing a clear-eyed view of the, quote, most brutal facts of your current reality, end quote, what you can never afford to lose is the, quote, faith that you will prevail in the end, end quote. That is, you must believe both that your situation will not get better anytime soon and that you will ultimately come out of it in the end. Business writer Jim Collins gets the credit for naming this the Stockdale paradox, but I think we see a much earlier example of it in Cabeza de Vaca's story. Listen to how similar 16th century Cabeza de Vaca and 20th century Jim Stockdale sound. Here's Cabeza de Vaca, quote, as for me, I know to say that I always had complete confidence in his mercy and that he would carry me out of this captivity. And I always said as much to my companions, end quote. Now here's Stockdale, quote, I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, end quote. I mean, what else is that if not faith in its purest form? How does the Apostle Paul describe it? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the convictions of things not seen. Well, in Cabeza de Vaca and Stockdale's case, faith seems to be the ability to admit to yourself the, quote, most brutal facts of your current reality while believing with equal sincerity that they can and will change for the better, whether or not that is true. So I'd argue that we really don't need to marvel or wonder at what precisely it was that allowed the castaways to endure their extra year of captivity between 1533 and 1534. Because they tell us quite plainly, and we should probably accept them at their word. It is their faith. And it may seem to us like an empirically irrational faith, or a faith in something absolutely absurd, but the utility of that faith to these men seems inarguable. And I'm not just talking about the utility of their faith to console them in their darkest hours. I'm talking about how faith becomes the actual tool by which they prove their worth to the natives and win enough respect to lift themselves out of the abject state they were in 1533-34. Because sometime during that year, somewhere in South Texas, the 4 expeditionaries began transforming themselves from abused slaves into esteemed medicine men. Cabeza de Vaca doesn't actually describe the details of how he or Castillo or Dorantes or Estevan or whoever it was started faith healing during that year. But he does comment just a few months later that the tribes around them had already, quote, heard news of us and how we were curing and of the marvels that our Lord was working through us, end quote. Which suggests, of course, that somewhere nearby, and sometime during that winter of 1533-34, the expeditionaries had begun to hone their craft. Now, of course, this wouldn't actually be the first time that the expeditionaries had called on their God to help heal sick Native Americans. Recall that Cabeza de Vaca and perhaps others had actually dabbled in faith healing at a particularly desperate moment back on Galveston Island. After a mystery disease had wiped out 80% of the Narvaez expeditionaries and half of the natives announced their plan to kill off the men that they suspected of having brought this blight down on their village. But then they pulled back and decided to give the castaways one chance to right the wrong that they believed they had caused. The natives told them, "You caused this problem, you fix it. Heal the sick." At first, the expeditionaries laughed, saying they didn't know how, but the natives weren't joking. And so, with their lives on the line, the expeditionaries prayed in unison, imitated the native medicine men that they had seen, said some Hail Marys and Our Fathers, and made the sign of the cross. The suggestion in the text is that whatever they did worked, or worked well enough anyway, that the expeditionaries weren't killed by the natives of Galveston Island. I should mention something else that Cabeza de Vaca also noticed back on Galveston Island. It was that medicine men were typically paid quite handsomely for their cures. To a cold, starving man in the depths of slavery, getting paid a few choice deer hides and maybe an extra meal or two would have certainly been motivating enough to at least try to imitate the medicine men that he had been observing now for more than 5 years. Because do you recall the goods that Cabeza de Vaca said he traded along the Texas coast during his year or two stint as a merchant? One of them was red ochre, which was one of the most precious pigments used by native medicine men in their ceremonies and in their self-painting, which suggests to me that Cabeza de Vaca must have had multiple opportunities to observe these medicine men in action. Despite all these clues, we're still left to fill in the blanks as to precisely how and when Cabeza de Vaca and his companions began faith healing again. But it's interesting to me that they should have started doing so in this, their hardest year of captivity, in conditions even more desperate than those they found themselves in back on Galveston Island. It's almost as though whenever circumstances made them most vulnerable, the expeditionaries were turned back to their faith, not only as consolation, but as the actual tool by which they were able to survive. Namely, by using it to heal the sick and demonstrating that they weren't just useless mouths to feed. And this, by the way, is where I see the direct parallel to believing in the Stockdale paradox. Because if you can simultaneously accept that your present circumstances are objectively hopeless, and at the same time believe, and I mean truly believe, that you will triumph over them in the end, then why can't you believe that by concentrating deeply, reciting the right prayers, and making the sign of the cross, that you might make yourself an instrument of divine intercession in the material world? And I'm dead serious when I say that, because that precisely is what Cabeza de Vaca believed. And remember, his faith keeps working for him. It sustains him. It heals the sick right in front of his very eyes. and it slowly but steadily begins to show him the way out of his current misery. But whatever God's plans were for Cabeza de Vaca knew they wouldn't be revealed to him where he was now. Quote, "Me hube de ir," end quote. I had to flee. And so, as the prickly pear tunas started to turn from green to purple, he began making his way deeper and deeper into South Texas, toward the sandy ranges of modern-day Brooks County perhaps, where he and his fellow expeditionaries, Alonso Castillo, Andrés Dorantes, and Estevan, had vowed to rendezvous exactly 1 year ago. On the next episode of Cabeza de Vaca. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and think this is a story worth sharing, please tell one friend. And if you haven't already, please go rate and leave a review for us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on therivardreport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache. It was composed by Kevin Graham and is available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andres Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State, and to David Dunham at Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions. You'll hear more about them throughout the season. And for more information about us and our other projects, you can check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.